Good morning. Should we close the door?
I don't know if it's standing here.
This is the IETF DTN working group meeting. It's under the note well. Therefore, everything you see or right is uncovered with this policy. This is the proposed agenda. So we'll have a very short announcement and discuss Scott Burley TCP, simple TCP, CL, then TCP CL, before. Brian is not available. George will actually take the lead on this presentation, and we have an implementation report of VPBIS, which is great. Lucien, are you in? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And update of VPSec. Any suggestions for changes or bashing of the agenda?
Yep.
Ed, are you still available for scribing as usual?
As long as I'm not talking. Yes.
Excellent. Someone would like to scribe while Ed is talking at the end of the meeting?
Note taker, please.
Are you using the
Oh, thanks.
Are you using Etherpad or you're just making notes? Stuart, if you want to just spark up a bit of Etherpad, that would be fine. I'm sure we can combine the two. Yeah. Blue sheets as well, just as the usual reminder, they should be circulating. There's not a vast number of us here.
So milestones, we did working group last call on VPBIS TCPCL, and hopefully we're past that soon. And this is the recall of our milestones that we have in the chart. So without further ado, Nicholas.
Hello everyone. This is just a quick advertisement on, because we are in network coding research group. We have a draft on how to make all the research in network coding applied to satellites systems. So we have identified lots of use cases, one of them being DTN. So for that respect, we may have old pointers to network coding and DTN. So, and the draft is maybe come working group last call soon. So if you want and anyone volunteers to review it, I sent it to the list and make an announcement here. We already had some emails to which I will reply as soon as I'm back home, take time to reply to it and update the draft as a consequence. So this is it. That's my small advertisement. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Now I need my co-chair.
Sorry. So you're going back.
I'm talking to the AD.
Right, but Scott is the next one.
Scott is the next one, sorry. And the mouse does not work. I think I have to just press the button. Scott, can you try using the Meet Echo join the queue thing? Because
So we don't have slides for Scott. He will be talking a few minutes, describing his draft.
the sort of remote desktop locked me out of this machine, I think. So, could someone on Jabber type Meet Echo just to try and attract their attention?
Maybe we'll come back to Scott after.
Yeah. Is this just gone silent?
If you press the button.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was thinking it was there, but we didn't see it.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So I only wanted a few minutes here just to give a quick overview of the simplified TCP convergence layer protocol draft that I posted a couple months ago. The motivation for this was if we needed to have a convergence layer draft in addition to the security and bundle protocol drafts, so that they could all go ahead at once, I thought a way to accelerate that might be to offer another convergence layer draft, which is what this is. It is much less. It's less capable than the TCP convergence layer draft we've been working on for a long time. It's very, very simple. It's 7 pages of specification, and a lot of that is boilerplate. Basically, all you do with it is you open a connection and you start sending bundles over the connection. Each bundle preceded by the length of the bundle. When the connection breaks, the connection stops, and you reestablish the connection so you can continue. That's pretty much it. This may be just too simple-minded even to bother with, but on the other hand, if it can move things along rapidly so that we can get into the editor's queue with the other books, I think that'd be a good thing. I will say that this very simple TCP-based convergence layer protocol has been implemented for many years. It's in heavy use on the International Space Station now. It works fine. It's a viable way to move bundles. And with that, I would stop and ask if there are any questions.
No.
There are a few people heading for the mic, Scott. So.
Hi, Scott. This is Jörg.
Hi, Eric.
Too bad I hope to see you here, but
Yeah, me too.
I do love simple things, so I'm certainly happy to have a simpler version than the TCP/C LV4 is right now. But I think this might be a bit too simple in one respect. At least we should be having some kind of TLS support here.
I agree that TLS is important. The way I addressed it in the spec was to say that that the establishment of TLS was outside this specification because people already know how to do it. We could add it if we thought we needed to, but
I think you won't. I think you won't get any specification through into any standard spec thing that doesn't do security properly anymore.
Okay.
But maybe Spencer can answer that.
Answer specifically.
TLS.
I was breaking up here.
Without TLS.
You wouldn't get anything standardized anymore that doesn't do TLS.
Spencer Dawkins is the outgoing area transport director for this working group. So I think that telling the truth is always appropriate. Let me tell you what I've heard so far. That you want to put this out. It is already in heavy use in some like real world environments that are really inconvenient to repair the other end of. You know it doesn't support TLS and you're not confused that this is somehow okay, except in these most restricted and monitored and people whose lives depend on it at the other end environments, so that there's somebody watching at all times at both ends. I think if you say that, whether it's in the Shepherd write-up or preferably in the draft itself, is it's like, here's the warning thing. We're documenting this because it's in real world use, and it should be okay to tell the truth about that. And I mean, maybe this is even a down ref for the for the other documents. But if the concern is that you want to do this because it's in use today in environments that matter, and it would help you do testing and things like that while we get the TLS support right and things like that, I think that's got a decent shot. The Shepherd write-up is going to matter. What it says in the document is going to matter. I can even call that out at last call time if you send it for last call before March.
We haven't adopted it yet, but
Do the right thing,
Yeah.
whatever that is. But so like I say, my high order bid is if this is the right thing to do, then telling the truth about what you're doing is going to take you a long way towards being able to do the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I say, I'd be thrilled because I mean the other part of this that we haven't mentioned in this conversation yet is the idea, how do you know that you've got the right convergence layer semantics? And the easiest way to do that is to have two of them. So it's like we're testing with this one. You can test with this one. You can test with that one. So you know that you're not looking at artifacts of the only convergence layer you've got. Is this making sense?
Yeah.
Because I mean, like I don't write this code, but I mean, if I'm lying to you, you would tell me because the truth is always appropriate in any direction. But that's the way it looks to me. If you said, would it be cool for us to slide one through without TLS support, and there's no plan to do one with TLS support, and we hope nobody notices? Okay. The answer, I would be less excited about doing that.
Sorry, Rick Taylor speaking, not as a chair. I don't, and I've got a review of this pending, which I actually just need to send to the list. I don't think it needs TLS because the bundles being shipped have their own security profiles that are applicable. So what might be being shipped along in the clear is an opaque blob of encrypted, authenticated material, and the only extra thing that could leak privacy, etc., is the length of that blob. Now we're sidestepping the entire end-to-end authorization. Do I know who I'm talking to, and do I trust there's not a man in the middle? But if you are happy with not having that level, that guarantee, Stephen's going to tell me I'm completely wrong, and I probably am.
We could. Oh, how convenient that a former security area director should pop up. You remember being on the ISG, right? No. Okay, well, sorry, I tried. But the good news is he didn't tackle me at the microphone before, so we could talk. But let you guys have that conversation. But what you're saying, I think, Rick, is a nuance that needs to be part of the conversation, which is, the people today, it's like, well, we can talk about authorization, but I kind of know where the satellite is pointed. So where the radio is pointed, which satellite. And if I missed, that's kind of on me. But like I said, but we can talk, but we can have that conversation. I realized that it would be great to ship something with TLS immediately.
Yeah.
So if that can happen, please don't let me slow you down. But if that's not happening and you guys need to get work done and make progress and things like that, it seems like to me that telling the truth about the situation is going to be your best strategy towards being able to do that.
Spencer, Mark, to respond, we're no more in the DTN ARG already, and DTN is no more only on space, links and stuff.
Yeah.
Except for the satellite, frequency things is no more, relevant.
But I think my point was you're talking about applicability statements. Where is this applicable? What? Yes and no. People put applicability statements in their protocol specifications. The standards process kind of assumed they would be two different documents, and everybody kind of freaked out about what that actually meant. So we don't do it very often. But people do put applicability statements in protocol specifications. I think that Stephen is giving you excellent advice, which is if
Stephen hasn't spoken yet, by the way, Scott.
I read his mind for 4 years. I mean, what do you want? But but so like, you know, so like I say, being able to say what, you know, where this is going to be appropriate and where this is not going to be appropriate to use, and what, you know, what the risks are, and that should be like, you know, 3 bullets that, you know, would scare off anybody who's not in using it for one of the targeted environments. Maybe that's okay. I can't promise, and I can really not promise when I'm not on the ISG after large. But I can tell you that I would support something like this if you were telling the truth about it, and I would be able to explain why that is, why that is a good thing. And I think based on this conversation, I could start the conversation during ISG evaluation, or even during last call. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Spencer.
So I'll get out of the way and let Stephen explain to you what I was saying. But
Hi, Stephen Farrell. It's actually saying something. So, I mean, I guess I would note that, you know, it's a TCP convergence there, right? So it's only going to be used when TCP is sensible. So it's not going to be used on a bunch of the weird ass links that you might use LTP to, which is kind of generally where it's safe to turn off the crypto. So, I mean, I missed what Scott said at the beginning about the current deployment in the space station. You know, if it includes a bit of the ground segment, if it was being used for some geosat kind of application, and I think the fact that if it is actually simpler, we know that the TCP convergence there is pretty much the only one that got used in terrestrial DTNs. So that would imply to me that if it really is simpler, it will be more used, and it'll be used in terrestrial DTNs, and that's exactly where you want TLS on all the time.
Rick Taylor again, without a chair hat on, I would counter that argument and say you can run TLS without requiring 802.x. You don't need the link layer to be secure in order to do end-to-end security. And the convergence layer in this case is the equivalent of the link layer. Okay, we're talking entirely in the clear, but what we're talking about is entirely opaque to any man in the middle. Sure, he can gather that bundle, and if the BPSec wrapper on that bundle is sufficient and correct, then who cares if he got it?
But not all bundles are encrypted at that level.
Okay, so the security consideration says there is no TLS on this. Don't send unencrypted bundles if you care about privacy.
I wouldn't believe that for a second.
Okay, and that might be the argument.
So just to interject here for a second, there's some language that says the values of parameters the connection for the convergence layer are assumed to be provided by management, and so we don't, and that includes the parameters for establishing the TLS protection of the connection. So that's it. The spec doesn't ignore TLS. It's outside. That is the establishment of the TLS is like the rest of the establishment of the connection, including things like, you know, what's the IP address, is outside the scope of specification. We don't have to say that. I'm happy to put in some language that says, here's how you do the connection, here's how you do TLS. It just seems to me that people already know how to do that. And if we say you should, then we shouldn't have to tell them how to do it. But I'm happy to put some more language in if that'll make things better.
Stephen Farrell, yeah, I mean, I just think that at the very, very minimum, it has to be really clear how to implement this over TLS. Because you're just not using a normal TCP socket. It might look like one, but it's not quite one. And especially if you end up with TLS 1.3, there are things to say. It's not very much, and it's really easy to do. And once, you know, if this became successful, then it's going to get out there. And if it gets out there with no crypto on, it will be a weak transport protocol. When the other ones that are coming out of the IETF these days have that kind of cryptographic protection. So, you know, there may be cases, I mean, if there are real deployment scenarios where the equipment really is far away and hard to get at, but why are you using TCP in that case would be my next question.
Well, for example, we use it right now on space station for connecting the science investigation payloads to the gateway machine on the space station. So it's TCP across the local area network on the space station, and then LTP over UDP from the space station to the ground.
Yeah, so the LTP one I can totally buy, but the even on the space station, it's like it's just it's a very large piece of equipment, but talking between different pieces of equipment is something that needs security too, because malware gets into things.
Okay, Jörg, got one more comment. We have a number of bad precedents for things having the term simple in their title. We discussed this a bit earlier, so maybe pick a different one.
That's fine. I'm happy to rename the specification. No problem.
Unidirectional or something.
Well, whatever. Just don't.
So, Rick, with my chair hat on, Scott, reading between the lines, I assume you're asking for working group adoption for this, because currently it's a personal draft, individual draft.
Well, correct. It's currently a personal draft. I'm asking for working group adoption if the working group feels that it's worth taking forward. I propose it because I'm hoping it might help us, move forward. And if so, then yes, I would like the working group to adopt it, and I'd like to move ahead with it. If it's not worth pursuing, that's fine. But it's really up to the working group.
Okay, so looking at the working group now, the question really is, if we were to adopt simple, or whatever we want to call it, TCP, does this give us an opportunity to take the pressure off TCP/CL, which, as we have worked on it, and including the authors and the working group over the last number of years, we have discovered, there are lots of options, there are lots of different ways we can, pipeline, and you're getting bidirectional, and I won't dig over all the work and churn that's happened. Does that give TCP/CL v4 a bit of breathing space to really, is there value in giving it the breathing space, or do we think we are so close to done with TCP/CL v4? And I know Brian and Jörg are going to speak about that in a minute. So I don't think a definitive answer until later in the meeting this morning. Yes. So please, during the next discussion, have that in the back of your mind.
So Ed Borain, quick question. When we were looking, for example, at BPSec, and we were talking about cipher suites and what different people thought were good cipher suites or bad cipher suites, this seems similar to the discussion of what is a good convergence layer and what is a not good convergence layer. There was a thought that you could have interoperability cipher suites, which would never be operational cipher suites, but they serve the purpose of making sure that you could have done a correct job with BPSec, not necessarily the cipher suite. Is this a case where the simple but not to be named simple TCP convergence layer has value because it will help from an interoperability standpoint show that BPBiz can run over something, and the point of this convergence layer is to show that BPBiz is correct as opposed to trying to be an operational convergence layer? And is that a useful distinction that would allow us to say, here's an interoperability TCP convergence layer, and later we will have an operational TCP convergence layer in TCP v4?
I would just observe there, I kind of like Spencer's formulation that it's always going to tell the truth. And the reality is that this very simple convergence layer is not only an interoperability demonstration convergence layer, it's in, like I say, it's in daily use. I think we can, in some sort of comment text in the thing, we could say, as we've kind of discussed, that we are well aware that there are many environments in which this is the wrong thing to use unless you use TLS or unless you do various things. And I'm perfectly fine with saying that. But I think it would be wrong to pretend that this is just an academic, exercise as opposed to something that can be used.
Stan Ryliff. The discussion here is about accepting the document as a working group document.
Well, not quite. We're going to hold that discussion until the other convergence layer presentation. So I spoke a bit too soon.
As what? As a standards track document, as experimental, as informational? I think one of the things that would help if this was published as informational, for instance, then all of the additional text that Scott just got through talking about, here it is, it's working, this is what we did on our summer vacation in one instance with the ISS, and it's working. However, in terms of security, it's not where it needs to be.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what Spencer was saying as well. Tell the truth. I mean, this document is something that's working and is being used to do good, but it's probably not what you'd want to use going forward. Yeah, in an industrial situation.
Well, what I think I've heard is that adding some language that says here's how a TLS is invoked when you run this thing is easy because TLS is easy. That being the case, just add TLS to this. I'm fine with that as well. I certainly wouldn't insist that nothing more than what's in this document would go forward.
Spencer Dawkins, responsible outgoing area director again. So don't get too hung up on the status for the document because the ISG has control over that once it's in an ISG evaluation anyway. So don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out what you wish it would be. Take your best shot, but don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. If part of the answer is that you can write something that says this is how to do TLS and that's not hard, and a more complete TCP-based convergence layer is on its way, that's also a really interesting conversation. Because the ones where you say no one should do this and there is no plan to develop anything else, those are the ones that are going to drive the ISG over the edge.
Scott, Mark here. Just a thought. Your protocol, per se, your convergence layer is essentially a subset of TCP/CL v4, right?
Well, it is in the sense that it uses TCP and uses TCP connections. There isn't anything in the convergence layer, the layer protocol that sits on top of TCP in TCP/CL. There isn't any of that in this document.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could, for example, merge the two documents in one and having a simple operation one and then the complex one. So, just a thought.
I'm not convinced that. Sorry, Rick. Mark, I'm not convinced it's going to work at all. TCP/CL has its own effective protocol on top of TCP, and Scott's pretty much says shove bundle down hole. It's that simple. Right, I'm sort of cutting this conversation here because we've got the TCP/CL presentation next, and then once we're both up to speed with both of the options, we can probably have a more productive discussion. So, anything more to say, Scott?
I've got nothing more for now.
Brilliant. In which case, I shall eject you from the queue.
By all means.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so TCP/CL v4. So I'm not Brian. I don't play him on TV either, just on IETF TV today. Brief update on TCP/CL version 4. I am a co-author. I have been putting lots of effort into TCP/ACL version 3. I have been commenting a lot on the early versions of TCP/ACL version 4. At some point, I got distracted and stopped paying attention. Lots of interesting things happened, and then I did a draft review and found lots of interesting things happened, which I wasn't at all convinced of in part, which may have led. I don't know how much of this has motivated Scott to do a simple version of TCP/CL before, whether he was just tired of waiting. In any case, so I had my share in this delay. Let me quickly get you through this, but the clicker doesn't work. Or do I need to click on the other side?
Is the clicker plugged into the laptop?
There is a clicker plug-in. Okay, so there were a bunch of obvious issues with TCP/CL version 3, part of this which came from us trying to be backward compatible with an earlier version of it. That has, to some extent, hindered flexibility and limited what we could design with. And there were some really ugly things that we came up with in the end, which have been fixed in version 4, which didn't need to be backward compatible. So this is actually very good. And the clicker still doesn't work. Oh, this is the wrong button. Maybe I don't. I'll just stop touching. So we try to be roughly culturally compatible with with the original version. Things got a number of enhancements, and there's lots more explanation. There's now a bunch of state diagrams and so forth. Next slide. But you probably have all read all of this. So we had. Brian did a round of edits based upon some comments issued, sent on the list, clarified context header exchanges, extended the section on how to use TLS, which requires more than just saying you want to use TLS, fixed a few things concerning timeout behavior and a number of other things that got resolved. I don't want to go into those in ample amount of detail because they are, I think, relatively uncontroversial. Next slide. There were a bunch of issues that I raised, and now I'm actually torn between myself because I'm the guy who raised the comments, and I'm at the same time supposed to report on those slides that say why they weren't addressed. So this is not going to be easy. So I'll give my personal opinion on this here. So the present TCP convergence layer version 4 draft has a bunch of extension fields, and given that we are trying to do something minimal, that I felt that this was way out of way too much, given that we have been squeezing bits out in all kinds of other places. So I don't know what possibly else we could want to extend, given that all this thing is supposed to do is shuffle bundles from A to B with a minimal framing. And I am a big fan of protocol designs that do keep extension points open, because you're really screwed when you lose all of them, but maybe we don't have to overdo it here. And we have a way of revving the entire thing. So I wouldn't consider this to be a big issue. But maybe there's where we can have on each of these a sense of the group, what people are thinking, whether it's worthwhile having this extensibility, whether anybody has thought of extensions they would love to do. Or whether we can reduce complexity by killing a few of these things.
Rick Taylor without chair hat on. So I'm with you for extensible protocols are the way forwards. So I'm fully in favor of extension items. I have an open question which I'm going to try and fit in at the end of the agenda, which is to do with neighbor discovery. So I know that some of the in fact, two of the open source implementations, one from Scott and one from, I can't remember who, but from the hackathon, both say, oh, and we do neighbor discovery. And neighbor discovery is undocumented anywhere. And I can see neighbor discovery being something that could be put in as an extension into a CL. So I think that might be a use case for an extension.
We discussed long years ago with a bunch of people about neighbor discovery issues in the sense of, but all those discussions revolved around multicast-based service advertisements, which
sure
wouldn't have any space in a TCP extension.
Okay, but I was just trying to.
But you would need to tie this together, and
Yeah.
you would need to have right identifiers and so on. So I can certainly see. Unfortunately, nobody ever bothered writing this down.
Indeed. But I would say that might, off the top of my head, be an example of an extension. So I say that I think extensions could exist in the near future. The 16-bit, 32-bit field question, given this is running over TCP, we're expecting this on a ground link. We're not talking across deep space or across complex environments and wireless networks and things like that. Do we really care about an extra 16 bits in the length field? I mean, I need to refer back to the draft, but if you don't have any extensions, you don't even bother writing down about extensions. Only in the presence of an extension are you going to start spending these 16 bits for your type and your 32 bits for your extension item length. And the extra 24 bits, do we really care in the use cases for TCP/CL?
I don't really think that you would really care if you can leave them out entirely.
I thought you could.
If that by default is doable, then you would never see those to begin with. So they wouldn't be in the critical path, and they wouldn't be showing up on most of the bundles. So that's probably just going to be fine to have them. It's still worthwhile asking the question usually the way you dimension things gives you an indication of what your plans are, right? So if we had 200 people lined up with extension wishes, sending DVD images as extension blocks or whatever, right? Then there might be. It's a question of are we properly dimensioning stuff for what we are expecting? That's the meta question that I had behind this point. Practically speaking, I don't care, and I don't think it makes a difference on much of a difference on the wire protocol, because most of the time the stuff won't show up.
The counter argument is 64K is plenty. If the extension item time is 8-bit, we're going to run out. And are we, given the use cases of TCP/CL, do we really care about an extra 8 bits? But this is starting to.
Okay, so I don't have a strong opinion here. But if you read this, you wonder who is going to use it, and then you can ask yourself where does modesty go? On the other hand, we have 32-bit processors, we have 64-bit processors, and sorry, I think we can move on to the next slide. So this is something that can be relatively. So I don't feel strongly here. If nobody else feels strongly, we can just leave it as is.
Rick, with chair hat on, this I think is a valid discussion for after this presentation, because the use cases of TCP/CL, if we were to include a simplified, a basic, the Scots simple TCP, is the one of the arguments could be that the use case for TCP/CL then becomes as a sort of backbone transit style protocol for bundles with lots of extension points, but designed to be quite fat on the wire, but giving you lots of flexibility and exciting features. Whereas at the edge of your extended DTN network, you might want to use simple TCP on your low power devices where you do actually care about protocol overhead. But that's a discussion for later.
Let me just do a side remark on that one, because if you wanted to use this in the backbone as 100 gigabit per second bundle transfer thing, then you don't want to have any extension points to begin with, because processing is just going to be too expensive at that speed.
Okay, but that might be the next conversation. So.
But okay, let's
just a second. Anybody has any idea or pros and cons on this? Or none?
Okay, then we have a two-way split of a message transmission. We have a transfer initialization, and then this is followed by the data segment. Originally, we had a separate length thing that was prefixed to a separate discussion or a separate transmission of a bundle, because we couldn't fit this in otherwise in a backward compatible fashion. Now that split into two pieces was preserved, but since we don't have to be backward compatible here, it might be just simpler to have this all in one thing. rather than having two individual segments that follow each other, because you need a more complex state machine. Suddenly you need to handle why, what happens if a transfer in it isn't followed by a data packet. And so you get additional machinery, you get additional special handling, and you might even have to wait for the other, or might want to wait for the other side to tell you whether something is too large, which gives you an extra round trip, which you might not want to have either. So therefore, my suggestion has been to just combine these two things and have a length prefix into the bundle segment and be done with it, and make that optional if you wish so. Or have it mandatory on every first thing, and that should simplify state machine and so on. So I think it's worthwhile a simplification, because you don't have to do extra, you reduce your state space and your error conditions. So I'm not at all arguing that the length isn't useful. So that I think we are all in violent agreement that this is a super helpful thing to have. This is why it was originally added. But just splitting it into messages is something that this spec can actually fix, which was broken before. And I'd love us to do this fix.
Rick Taylor without chair hat on. I seem to remember some discussion about the transfer in it as a convenient, oh, you said, sorry, normally bullet point, it's for transfer extension items. So if you were to combine the two by saying this is the first segment.
Right, you have the
it's a sort of
aspect
semantic
anyway
change.
that you say. So
yeah. Sorry, ignore me.
No comment.
Then there was some confusion. This might have been confusion on my side on the session term exchange. So in the original in TCP/CL version 3, after sending a session term message, you couldn't send any more data, so that this would actually be pushing your data. That the last thing you would receive on a TCP connection would be the term, which meant that you could do a one-way close or one-way shutdown after that. If you may continue remaining data items after a session term message, I was wondering why an implementation would send a session term message before that, and then making everybody's life more difficult. So this seems to be, again, requiring special handling, and therefore my take on this was, let's not have, let's keep the original semantics, so that we can be sure that when I receive session term and I echo session term, I have received all the data and I can close the connection. That seems sensible, because then we don't get any kernel layer buffering issues or whatever. Seems to be actually a minor simplification, but I don't. But I missed what the original motivation was when this came up, and so I don't want to.
Okay, Rick Taylor again, and I'm looking at Ed because he was sat in the meeting we were having about this. This was an offline discussion, actually. I seem to remember somebody started down this line of thought because it was the idea where you have a pool of threads that are all streaming bundles simultaneously, and one of the threads receives an interrupt from somewhere to say, you all need to hang up now. The thought was it could chuck out a session term just into the egress queue, while everything else was still chucking out its segments.
So you would have a multi-threaded TCP/CL implementation that would be sending from multiple threads across. But then you would actually need to synchronize your TCP/CL write access pretty.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's actually a valid. In retrospect, I'm not sure that means it's a good idea or a correct. It may just have been one of those things that was discussed, and I think you may have a valid point there. Ed, I'm looking at Ed to see if Ed remembers any of this.
Hi, Ed Borain. I remember none of this.
No, okay. You may not have been there after all.
Well, no, I was there, and I recall when some of this was up. The major question I have is this needs to be well explained in the draft. And it should not be for us to try and understand and reverse engineer the reasoning for this. If it is not there in the draft, it needs to be. If the draft cannot defend this more complex behavior, then I think it should be simplified.
Okay, so we would probably need to find somebody who remembers the. Maybe Brian, probably Brian does. So he.
Brian was there, so yeah.
I just can't say more on this because I'm lacking the background why this was
Yeah,
originally
in the sake of
motivated.
openness, I believe we have some notes from the face-to-face where that discussion may have occurred, and that isn't private material, so that could be shared with the list if we haven't done so before.
Then the draft actually got a bit more verbose and was explaining more terms. Not all of some of these terms I think were useful for illustrative purposes. This is the second bullet on that slide right now, but they aren't used later on. So this may be confusing that you introduce terminology and then you don't use this anymore. And looking at how people read specs, that they usually get more tired with every page. Usually trying to save a page is worth the effort because people remain more attentive. So I'd be always in favor of having something short, but I don't feel strongly here. If people believe there is use, then I don't. It just occurred to me that it might be sometimes more confusing than helpful. But I see the good intentions that are beyond that. So I'd love to see comments from other people on this specific point so that we can move ahead here.
I'm wondering if the co-authors should talk together.
Well, we may have opposing views on this.
That's not the first time in the IETF that co-authors have different point of view.
Co-authors
could resolve them.
Well, co-authors are we are by default editors who are supposed to reflect the consensus of the working group in writing, right? So we actually need guidance from the working group on what the working group wants us to do, and then we can figure out how to do it.
Well, up to now, I haven't heard any comment on these questions, so it looks like you probably be the best people to actually resolve them.
Okay. So there is a workable implementation. I suspect there's I don't know how many other implementations do exist there, but it's proven that this can be made to work, which is good. So we do have running code here. That's if we simplify a few things, the implementations can follow. So this is we have a practical way forward. Having listened to the previous conversation about these simple TCP convergence layer, if I'm using that term now, I'm wondering, we also put TLS in here, TLS support. And the same reasonings that we put forward for the previous discussion for not having TLS would apply here in principle. So the question is, what got us actually forced to add TLS to this? I think it's good to have the support, but I'm wondering what was the exact trigger, if anybody remembers.
Rick, as chair, if I remember correctly, it was the exact counter argument to Spencer's point, which was we've got running code, it's kind of running on, ISS and within a few secure boundaries, and it's good enough just for now, and we want to write it up. For TCP/CL, this was seen as a gold standard transit grade convergence layer, and therefore, yeah, it must just have TLS in there, and there was no one raised an issue with it. Good. It was the different.
So then we got this right. This is good. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all we have.
Okay.
So we probably will do a version 11 at some point. We would hope that we are going to get some feedback from the group. Speaking up to some of these things, the discussion on the mailing list was reasonably short-lived. There was a flurry of messages, but then things died down again. It's hard to second guess what would be the right choice if you have your own. If somebody gives us an engineering direction we should follow, then we can surely work that out. if we are supposed to set this direction ourselves and we have disagreement on what the direction should be, then it's hard to come up with something. We can always try to compromise on this point or that point, but it'd be great to get feedback of what people perceive that they need.
Mark here, I'm guessing that you should, the two of you have a call next week, iron out the details and make this forward. We've been waiting for years about this. And I think what I'm seeing is at the level of some details that, just make a decision together and move forward. I haven't heard anybody here, and we haven't seen that much of traffic on the mailing list about those topics. So it seems to be like, okay, let's decipher something and move forward. We've been waiting for TCPCL to forward, BP this, and the whole thing is waiting.
So it shouldn't essentially take long. That's true. Okay, but maybe we have the other interesting discussion now. What is now the relative position of the two potential CLs with respect to each other?
So Rick, with chair hat on, looking at Mark, do you want that discussion now? I think this might be a good point.
Sure.
So,
but we need to, anyway, this document is very mature, right?
Yeah.
We could make it happen next week if the two co-authors, finish the work, right?
Well, let's make it in 2 weeks. Next week is already full, but
okay, 2 weeks. So, 22nd of November. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So, thank you very much.
We have the minutes, right? 22nd of November.
Okay, so as Mark alluded to, and following on from now, we've heard about both CLs. TCPCL has been a long time to get to this point. There's been numerous reasons, some of it because of one of those classic moments of when you start looking into a protocol, you realize that there's actually a fair amount of complexity in something that sounds so simple on paper. It may be that we're trying to slightly boil the ocean in places, and we've been around this loop several times, but we are where we are, but we need to get it finished. So the policy has been that the triumvirate of BP-BIS, BP-SEC, and at least one convergence layer must be ready to go forward together to the IESG so that we can not only define how a bundle is defined, we can secure a bundle and we can move a bundle, and therefore we have a basic DTN protocol stack. Currently we have 2 out of 3, so there is some urgency to have a convergence layer so that we can demonstrate interoperability and everyone can go and test that their lab implementations are suitable for taking on to the next step or running it live as they see fit. So with the arrival of Scott's simplified TCP document, does that buy some time to get TCPCL really good? Is it, and I'm not weighting any of these statements, is it a replacement for TCPCL? Is it interesting, but we've got TCPCL? Do they both have value because they're addressing different use cases? Can they learn from each other? Can simplified TCPCL become section 1 of the TCPCL document, as Mark suggested? Open questions to the room.
Jörg, so I think I have 1.5 observations to share. From earlier standards work that I did elsewhere, one guy was famous for quoting, saying that hard plus easy is harder than hard. And because you have to figure out how to do optional things in implementation, you need to figure out, in some cases, both ways. You need to have fallback ways. And so this gets me to one part, especially this fallback part gets me to one thing. We need to differentiate between the two. We can, of course, pick different port numbers and say we are going to have one port number for this version and one port number for that version, or we are going to use the same port, but then we'll need to have a magic cookie in the beginning that allows you to figure out which version you are running. So there's a bit of admin blurb around that in order to be able to, for two entities to talk to each other. If all we needed was the simple version, be it. I mean, I'm going to save lots of time. If there would be a coexistence, we would need to figure out how that's supposed to work. We would just need to have a way of differentiating and allowing either upgrading or whatever, and understand what are the respective spaces that these respective implementations cover, and then go back to the question, what are we actually needing? At some point, whenever a working group engineers something, we sometimes lose sight of what our requirements are. And maybe double check whether the space covered by one of the two implementations is actually, of the simpler one, is large enough. All that bears the risk that we might delay both in the end. So it may be worthwhile getting, I don't think TCP/SCL version 4 does need much breathing space, because most of the stuff is done. There's some simplifications where there were some fixes now put into the latest version. So one can probably ship this at some not too distant point in the future, and but I don't mind having a simpler version either. So take this as a bunch of value-neutral observations from my side of what you should consider, what the implications might be, and what we should be looking at.
So Spencer Dawkins is responsible transport area AD for this. I got up to say something that actually became smarter the longer he talked. So thank you. If you're talking about, reusing the same port for both versions of this, that actually turns out to be a big deal to the people who do port reviews at IANA. So that's not the only possible answer, but that is definitely the right answer. So thinking about that, number one. Number two, and this is, I think, related to that, where we are in Quick, where we say we want to have versioning, but that means you have to have two versions in order to test that. Okay, so if the answer is that this is going to run on one protocol, then you're going to be, as part of your support for two testing now, you'll start that, but you've also got two convergence layers fairly quickly that you can test both of, and you can demonstrate that this is the behavior you're looking for is not tied to one particular convergence layer. That would be helpful also. So I think I only had one reason to say what I was going to say, but I think you just gave me two reasons to say that. Simple, one thing I'm using around here more frequently than simple these days is probably minimal. If that helps. That way everybody in the room won't twitch uncontrollably when you say it every time, like we all are now.
So Rick, individual, I wasn't proposing that minimal TCP and TCP/CL should try and run on the same port and multiplex. I mean, obviously, one can do that by putting a cookie on the front. I believe TCP/CL already has an equivalent cookie at the part of the session initialization. There's a unique identifier. You can spot that you're there. So it could be doable, but again, it adds complexity to simple. So but it makes getting ports easier. So there's a compromise, and that's something for the group, and it's almost admin trivia, but it is relevant. I suppose, following on point, your grade raised a good point about use cases. That if we're going to have two CLs that look actually as though they live in the same domain, loosely, there needs to be some use case guidance, because otherwise, say I'm a brand new academic organization or company who goes, oh, I need a CL for my bundle protocol. Well, I'll use the easier one to write. And we might have ended up spending a lot of time developing a sophisticated TCP-based convergence layer that never gets used because there's a simple one which just takes less code.
Yeah.
And so without a use case, there's no compelling reason to use the more complicated one.
Yeah, and Stephen was right about people twitching uncontrollably when you say applicability statement. If you want to see people twitch uncontrollably really hard, say use cases. Don't do that. So say, where is this applicable?
Yeah.
You know, just friendly guidance from a friend.
But we all know that means a use case.
Mark, here, we need to know from the working group if we want to have one TCP layer, two, both, which one. One point might be that the Spencer was saying about don't take too much time on the status of the document, but it might be a case where simple is actually experimental. Therefore,
Also good work.
right. So that tells, this is, doesn't have the same, level of, and then we've been talking, spending 3 years on TCP/CL. This is the standard track one, and experimental is there. You can use it, and then I think we send the right message.
So, Stephen Farrell, and speaking from a fairly ignorant position, because I only just scanned these documents now, and I don't currently implement this stuff, so it sounds to me like you're saying that the TCP/CL before is within weeks of being done. Was that what you said earlier?
It could be.
It should have been done.
Right. So
and it has been multiple working group last call. It was done a few months ago. But
sure. Yeah. But
we had one come or more.
It just pragmatically, it seems the chances of a 0.0 getting adopted and overtaking that in time seems pretty slim, no matter how simple it is. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think there is a functional difference between these, if I'm remembering correctly, in that even though reactive fragmentation is not a thing that's in the current BPBIS, if I remember rightly, it still is a thing, and you could only do that with the TCP/CL one. You couldn't really do it with the new, simpler version because you don't know how far you've gotten.
Yeah.
So I think there is a functional difference between them.
Yes. TCP/CL is also bidirectional, whereas Scott's one is you dial up, send, hang up, effectively, says uni.
Yeah. So I mean, just again from an uninformed position, I would say finish that one that you've nearly finished, and then think about the other one. And as long as you can mux them, then you can figure out the rest later.
The counter, Rick Taylor again. Personally, the counter argument to that is TCP/CL has proven to be more complicated to get finished than we expected, and we might be falling into the trap of, oh, it looks like it should just be a couple of weeks. It's just a few hundred words change and we're fine.
November.
Yeah, no, November 22nd has been quoted, but I mean, but could the presence of minimal TCP, simple TCP, buy TCP/CL some time within the working group to really get right and iron out these problems, or are we just delaying for the sake of delaying? Okay.
So I don't know, but there's existing code for the TCP/CL thing, right? Or
have you got
TCP/CL?
Is there an existing implementation? No. Okay.
I believe Brian, who is not on MeetEcho, has a Python-based proof of concept, but it's not connected to a bundle protocol agent. Okay. It's I can shove blobs from A to B.
The only point I was going to make was that back when we were using DTN2 and there was a TCP/CL, it was kind of like this. It was very hairy and crappy, but it worked and nobody cared. Because you're generally using it where once you had a contact, you had plenty of bandwidth, so you didn't give a shit. Yeah. So as long as it works, it would get used.
And I think that's the thought behind Scott's simple TCP of it's just like, let's just do it and just make it work.
So my point was that if somebody has shown that you can implement and use the TCP/CL version 4, then that'll be fine in almost all cases. And so I don't think you would see a simpler one displacing an existing implementation if the implementation exists. If there was no such implementation, then maybe. But if there is, then you just configure a TCP and off you go.
What about the small pool of before simple only or both?
Yeah.
Okay, we need your help. Please wake up. Stop reading Facebook. We'll do a small poll. 3 questions, just to get the sense of the room. Yeah. Only TCP CL v4. Only simple TCP CL, Scott one, or both, maybe like I was saying, kind of a standard one and experimental, or things like that. At least one is awake.
Let me make one, Jörg, let me make one quick comment. If I like Scott's simple thing, but if it is really only unidirectional and the one who connects sends, then this isn't applicable to the terrestrial version of DTN at all, because we have many nets and firewalls who won't allow. So just the simple version is not an option.
Okay, well, that's
a valid point. But equally, and that could be a reasoning, Rick Taylor again, sorry, to make it experimental and say this is good enough for your lab testing and some basic interrupt testing, but it's not going to work in the wild for those exact reasons. Yeah. Yeah, agreed.
Just Stephen Farrell, but I disagree a bit with what you said, Rick. Okay. There are scenarios where exactly what you want is to establish an outbound TCP session, send some packets, and then bugger off. Yeah. Like lots of sensor kind of things.
Absolutely.
So, whereas if you wanted an actuator, or then you need the more complicated ones.
So this again is the applicability statements of both protocols. One is, TCP CL v4 has all those properties you might want to use for a transit network where you've got bidirectional order. Transit may be the loosest term, but sort of backbone-y style, let's shovel packets on big, fast pipes. And simple TCP has the sensor network, dial up occasionally, shovel your data off, hang up. They both have validity.
Well, the other point I'd make is that you have actuators as well. So actuators generally need an inbound.
Yeah.
So, but they still are behind a NAT or something maybe.
Go ahead, Scott.
One other thought on the existence of the code is that we do end up, I think, certainly with bundle protocol, we ended up with like lots of different implementations, just because, partly because people wanted lots of different implementations for various reasons, partly because people use different languages. And I think that that might be an advantage of having, as an option, a minimal TCP convergence layer that anybody who wants to can hack together in an afternoon and start working with it, and they can do it in Python, they can do it in Rust, they can do it in C, they can do it in TCL, and not have to work very hard at it. That's all.
So let's do it. TCP CLv4 only, simple TCP only, or both in probably kind of different status. So please for TCP CLv4 only. I like when are binary. Any other is to me. Simple TCP-CL only. Okay, we'll see the next one if either both with different status. Okay.
So for the record, the minimal hum was for both. I think Stephen's going to say what I was just about to say, which is I'm not sure the experimental was part of the question, but we can discuss the statuses at that point.
I mean, I care. I mean, if they are for different purposes, then they can both be proposed under.
Well, but the difference to me also is the fact that experimental not only sends a message, but also says, for example, to the ISG that, if there's no TLS in it, or, then it's
Putting TLS, Rick here, sorry, quickly, and I know Fred is in the queue. Putting TLS in is actually, having done it recently to a TCP protocol, is actually quite simple. It's call out the BSIP, and there's pretty much some boilerplate code, and the security groups will hold your hand. It's not hard. Fred, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So if both go forward, the TCP-CL and the simple TCP, if the simple TCP goes through as experimental and it's done way earlier than the TCP-CL, would that experimental allow the bundle protocol to move forward?
Rick Taylor answering with a chair hat on. I think the presence of a convergence layer really helps. We don't immediately have the answer of whether having standards track documents relying on having a canonical reference to an experimental document. I'm not quite sure. That's a discussion with the IESG and the ADs, but it can only help.
We'll have a TCP-CL v4 by November 22nd.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Ed Bahrain, and this is similar to Fred's question, which was what we just hummed on was working group adoption of those documents. But the question behind that is both don't need to be finished to put BPBIS forward.
Yeah.
And in fact, we would be comfortable with either of them, and whichever one could be done first.
And Rick, as chair, I don't, first off, as Mark has pushed Jörg quite hard on this, we may well get TCP-CL done pretty quickly. I think we could get minimal, simple TCP-CL done pretty quickly as well. Put TLS on the front of it, we could probably go standards track, or whatever the ISG deems is the right tag. As Spencer pointed out, they can change it. We might be able to get both done quickly, but this means everyone in the room and dialed in and on the mailing list needs to actually help. We can't just sit back and wait for Scott, Jörg, and Brian to finish this and demand they finished it. And that applies to me as well as to you. We've got to help with this because I know we're all keen to get this stuff finished. So let's help. Okay.
Okay, Lucien?
One last point. I am taking that hum as the room approves working group adoption of Scott's simple TCP, whatever it will be called. We will have to double check that on the list because that is the correct way of doing it.
Hello, my name is Lucien. I work for a company called RedMesh, and we are doing terrestrial DTN. Our goal is mostly to connect and try to provide service to underserved communities. And we are doing that primarily through mesh networks. And recently we got interested into the DTN because of the ability to move data on and off remote outposts as data mulling. So we are targeting consumer devices. So we made an implementation of DTN on Java. So that's so we started implementing BPBIS on August this year. Actually, I tried to implement it before that, the previous RFC 5050, and I only discovered quite recently that the IETF group has moved to an IETF. So it really started on August for the new implementation. It's about 40,000 lines of code, 3 megabytes packaged. And it implements, as of November 2018, draft IETF BPBIS 11, simple TCP that Scott sent a few months ago. And during the hackathon, I also implemented the BPSec with the minimum interrupt, like Biren sent a draft with only two cipher, one for the encryption and one for the integrity.
which are part of the implementation now. The code is public and available on the following address. So overall, the draft is pretty clean. It was fairly easy to implement. There is a few areas which made the implementation slightly difficult. Mostly, it's not for what the draft was saying, but for what it was not saying. So that's mostly the storage on the routing, because I mean, I had the trouble to wrap my head around the endpoint ID. What exactly does that covers? Is it an identifier? Is it a resource location? Is it a route? I understand that the draft makes the interpretation of the EID fairly flexible for the use cases. And it's both an endpoint for the bundle, but it's also the identifier of the node that hosts the service. So yeah, we made some implementation decision, which I'll present. And if you have any question or critiques, we are open for the discussion. Minor problem on the actual design of the draft. It's not really a problem, but a comment really. When it comes to parsing the DTN ID, EID, I think there's a lot of ways to code it. The IPN is a CBOR array of two integers. The DTN scheme is either a CBOR text string or a CBOR integer if it's a none. I think it adds some complexity, which really isn't necessary because at the end it's just an URI. So a string should probably be covering everything without having to do those distinctions. And I'm not sure the value of having an integer in just 1 byte as opposed to a string, which takes a few bytes more, is really useful. The other thing was the notion of the retention constraints. Since the RFC doesn't cover anything to do with storage, I think the word doesn't even mention once. The retention constraints is mostly informational. So there is no if statement in the draft that says if retention is that and that, then we do something differently. So, I mean, I added the retention constraint into the code, but it's if it were removed, it wouldn't change the logic so far. Yeah, next please. So this is now I will cover some implementations decisions that we take for that we decided. So as I said, an EID is mostly an URI, so it should be anything. However, when it comes to the application agent registration, we decided that since the service is hosted on an actual host, bundle node, we would just happen whatever is the strings that the application agent registers to the DTN ID of the bundle node. So if your bundle node has a DTN node 1, and your application would register, for instance, to backup, then the identifier for the service would simply be like the concatenation, pretty much like an HTTP service. The reason is because if we were to allow any application to register to any DTN, first of all, there would be some problem with impersonation. But even without that, that means it wouldn't work until we develop a DTN resolver system, like akin to a DNS, a root locator. On having the service binded to the host means we just have to care about the routing and doesn't have to care about resolving on top of the routing to resolve an EID to an actual node location. And similarly, since each URI has its own scheme on scheme-specific part, I was wondering how exactly are we supposed to process an URI which we don't know the scheme. Let's say it's called a specific scheme comma. Like, what do we do with that? Should we try to match it to the longest prefix that we have in any routing table that we have? Should we delete it? Should we store it until someone talks to us? Again, I believe that's out of scope of the draft, but having an informational draft about the best practice would be interesting because when it comes to interoperability, if I can't expect a certain behavior when I send a bundle, it makes that behavior unpredictable. Next, please. So in order to address those issues, we introduced something we call a convergence layer adapter specific endpoint ID, which is a way to mix in only one address both a node identifier and a root location, meaning it's basically an interface identifier. So for instance, for the simple TCP that we implemented, every simple TCP channel is binded to a unique singleton EID. So for instance, it would be CLA STCP followed by the IP on the ports it uses for the communication. And yeah, I think having this model could be interesting to add it as a draft or maybe in BPBs, because then it allows, how can I put it? Like for instance, we discussed about STCP versus TCP/CL on TLS. I feel that right now STCP is pretty good because whether we are running STCP over a secured channel with TLS or whether we in a plane, the STCP would not change. It would be the same way to move bundle from one point to another. However, where this decision is taken to open a TLS socket or a TCP socket, I think it's out of scope of the protocol. It's something that should be done within like the peer discovery or the neighbor discovery or link layer management, but it's another module which is not part of the protocol itself, which is really just a link. Every convergence layer is just a one-hop link. The security should not be one-hop, it should be end-to-end, or if the link moves over the internet, then we can open a TLS socket, but that doesn't have to be a feature of the actual protocol that sends the bundle. Right now, on the draft, the services that each convergence layer should offer is only two, is send and receive bundles. It doesn't say anything about if the application agent registers security, then every link on the way should be secured. So until the services of the channel are just sending and receiving bundle, I don't really understand the need to add neighbor discovery with contact header, TLS negotiation with some negotiation. So that was the rationale behind the implementation of STCP. First of all, it's much easier, and then everything else can be covered by other modules that would work separately. So the nice thing also with CLI IDs is that because it's unambiguous and binded to every channel uniquely, it can also be used to proactively open the channel. So when I receive a bundle, for instance, in Terra, so it's the name of the implementation, if I receive a bundle with a CLI IDs, or any EIDs for that matter, if we can resolve it at the end, we end with a CLI ID, we can proactively open sub-channel. Using basically it also acts as a negotiation. It can host any parameters that from which you can derive the parameters of your session. So yeah.
Sorry, Rick. Personally, I'm waiting for Scott to jump in on this. I think Scott's original vision, and it may not have been Scott's, but as I understood it when I first started getting involved with DTN, was that the endpoint identifier would be late bound, and this was seen as a very positive aspect. So I'm wondering, and I like where you're going with the CLA EID, but I think it adds early binding. So I need you to send it to this IP address using SCTP protocol. And I'm looking at the room for those who are great advocates for the late binding. So the idea that I can, but I also understand it's the link local step. So here comes Scott.
Just let me answer this question. Yeah. I'm not advocating for every bundle ID to use a CLID. This is just a one-hop identifier. Yeah. Maybe it will be more clear in the next slides. Oh. Scott, you want to ask a question?
Yeah. And I was anticipating what you just said, that it seems like the CLA EID would be very useful and would be an optimization for some environments and some applications, and it would not necessarily supersede what we're doing with endpoint identifiers in other environments. So I think this can be, I need to understand it better, but it seems like useful innovation, and I would not try to discourage it at this point. I think it's worth talking about.
Yeah, actually, the introduction of this CLI ID was mostly for my testing at the beginning, because I needed to ping or send with STCP bundles. And at that time, my DTN ID was generated randomly. So I first every time had to check, and I was thinking it would be much better if I could just in the EID select IP port, and then that would find its way itself. Next slides will be more informational because so this is not actually the next one, but for this one, the idea was just maybe we could just add a new service to a convergence layer rather than just sending and receiving bundle. Maybe a convergence layer should also state what is the CLA ID of the current channel. So every time a channel is opened by a convergence layer, it should provide as an API the IDs of the remote peer. And if the channel is symmetrical, it should also provide the ID of the local peers that the peers can use. So when we will be on a bundle forwarding algorithm, there is a line that says that is the ID local. So having this ID coming from the CLA would allow us for filling, the local ID table. And so from there we were able to build a link local table, which is only the one-hop view of the neighborhood, which are the mappings between CLI IDs on actual interfaces, the handle that from where we can send and receive bundles.
So Rick Taylor, so basically you've got your equivalent of your ARP table now.
Exactly. So it's just a one-hop table that has no other interpretation than the actual interfaces. So so it has to follow the CLI ID scheme so that we can process them. Yes.
Sorry, I was partly not paying attention. Can you go back to one slide very briefly? For the first example, I think having ports is good. What do you do with an IPv6 address?
Right now it's just IPv4, but if it were an IPv6, you would find a way to express the IPv6. Like you can just show it like this with 2 point.
Just for your coding, yes. You probably need some
the HTTP IPv6 URN encoding thing. It's you just call it out. But sorry, Rick, jumping in the queue here. I'm totally agreeing with you here, Lucien. If it's a this slide too, if it's a convergence layer service, then the convergence layer can hand out names that it knows how to parse. So I can send you any old random blob and say, if you give that back to me, I know what that means, and you don't need to care. But it's an identifier.
Can you move up just a second? So the way it works is that it's very it's a little constrained, but if it starts with CLA, then you have pretty much like a normal AID, a CLA scheme followed by a CLA specific part. And that parser or serializer is provided also as a service of the convergence layer. So for instance, when I receive a bundle with a CLI AID, I will try to find a convergence layer that will accept this ID. If it does, then I can so basically I have a service. Can you try to create an opportunity with that ID that right now is not in my link local table? On every convergence layer that receives it, if it recognizes the scheme, then it tries to parse the scheme specific port, and then it tries to create the connection over STCP if it's STCP or TCP/CL if it's TCP/CL. That is configurable. So if you don't want people to abuse this, but you can,
Go ahead, Scott.
Just an observation, I guess. When I saw the slide that said there had to be a singleton convergence layer port, essentially, I just wanted to observe. It'd be best if that were not required to be only a single one. We have use cases that I'm having to deal with all the time now, where we've determined that we're going to send from node A to node B, and there are multiple convergence layer paths to get from node A to node B, and depending on the nature of the bundle, we're going to select one or another. And so for that purpose, there's something in ION now called a convergence layer manager that reads stuff out of the queue that is destined for node X and figures out which of the possible multiple convergence layer paths to node X to use for that bundle. And I think that's ultimately a useful capability, and I think quite desirably it is completely buried underneath bundle protocol. Bundle protocol doesn't see or know or care anything about this. It's it is a convergence layer decision.
Yeah, I agree. It's not, I mean, maybe singleton was a misusing of the word. It doesn't have to be a singleton, it has to be unique for the channel. So if the channel is multicast, the only goal is to, if you have a CLI ID, it should uniquely open a channel. And that should be unique for that instance of the channel.
Identifiable. Yeah. Good. Done.
So now that we have this link local view, we're able to move to the actual resolution of an EID that can be any IID as a draft wants. So basically the way it works that we can have now routing tables that maps a classic EID that is generic, flexible, and that can represent anything. But at the end, if you want to make a forwarding decision, that should derive to an actual CLI ID, which represents an interface. So in this instance, where you have a small routing table with DTN node, 3, 1, I mean, it could be anything. If resolving an EID means finding the forwarding set of interfaces where you can try to forward a bundle. So next slide, please. So right now, the forward in the draft, I mean, BPB's draft, there is only one rule. So if it's local, deliver locally. If it's not local, select the set and try to forward. Otherwise, try to forward later when the opportunity makes it happen. So I would be in favor of adding 2 new rules. That would be, look, if it's not local, look up the link local table for one-hop direct forwarding. If the EID is a CLI EID, then you can just directly direct that bundle to the interface. Otherwise, you can look up your routing table. Now the routing table it's the resolver basically. So you can have a classic routing table. I'm not sure if that part should really be part of the BPBs or something else, but I think it's fairly intuitive to have a routing table. So it doesn't have to be the way to forward the bundle, but it can be used. That could be the minimum set of services that the bundle protocol provide generically. And then we added a few other modules which are extension-based, which are out of scope of the bundle protocol, I believe. But we are thinking of having a routing block, meaning like in the bundle. So the bundle could carry its own forwarding strategy. For instance, if it wants to be routed using the GPS of the phone, so we are using phones to be, that's the goal. We want phones to be bundle nodes. So there's a lot of things that we can, how it's called. So if we have a path which is made of predictable nodes, like a bus, freight, trains, buses, that is like the satellites kind of use case. It's mostly delay that you are dealing with. But if you are in a network made of randomly moving nodes, then it becomes an opportunistic network, and the routing strategy is very application dependent. So it would make sense that each bundle could carry element of its own routing strategy. It could be its own routing table if it only wants to be forwarded through trusted nodes. It could be it could be anything, geographical data, and then extensible modules. So that's why so go back to the algorithm. Step 1, it's local. Step 2, it's link local. Step 3, looking at the routing table. Otherwise, we try to somehow do a custody transfer inside the bundle node, saying if a module wants to take care of the routing of this bundle, then take it. And that would be, I would imagine, directed by the routing block. Otherwise, it goes into cold storage. So that's what our implementation is doing. Then it tries to create an opportunities using the CLI IDs on the forward set.
Okay, so Rick Taylor speaking personally, I understand what you're talking about in terms of having a bundle carrying a routing strategy. I was waiting for some of the older IETFers in the room to suddenly jump to the microphone and say source-based routing has proven to be a unwise idea in some circumstances in the fixed internet, because intermediate nodes often have a better idea of reality than the sender. I'm trying to think of the right words. There's always traditionally been a lot of pushback. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea under some circumstances, but there are dangers there. So whatever handling has to be optional. Yeah, but we have bundle in bundle, but that's quite a careful use case of tunneling, rather than the sender saying, I need this bundle sent by this path to the endpoint.
Doesn't
And I know
have,
you're not quite
doesn't have
saying
to
that.
be that precise. It could be, I just want to get in this geographical location, and anybody with a GPS can understand if it's a forwarder or not.
Yeah, and that's fine. And I'm not.
My point is, it's not source routing really. It's the bundle carries its routing strategy. Whether it's source routing or anything else, is up to the routing block.
Oh, okay. So it's more like a sort of a quality of service decision strategy. So please route geographically.
If it is geographic,
yeah,
it's mostly like. I mean, my experience in opportunistic networks is that the routing and the application goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
You can't try to find. There's been thousands of papers on each of them addressing a specific routing issue on an optimization. You can have like epidemic on constrained epidemic, controlled epidemic, random epidemic, and then you have the pure forwarding strategy, geographical routing. But at the end, it boils down to what the application needs. It makes sense that the bundle being a big blob of data that doesn't require us to open a session because it contains every information in itself, makes sense that it may also contain its routing strategy, at least for a certain portion of the DTN region, which might be challenging.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Go ahead, Scott.
I just wanted to suggest that this is a really interesting discussion, and it's sort of been going on for about 15 years, and I think we're making solid progress on figuring out which of these things work under what circumstances. All of which I'm deeply convinced does not belong in the bundle protocol specification. It belongs in other documents because there are volumes, right? We can just go on forever talking about this stuff. And if we try to include all these kinds of considerations in the bundle protocol spec, we would end up with a specification that nobody would be able to lift, much less read. So I encourage this kind of thinking. I think it's great. I think discussing the options for things that may resemble source path routing or maybe not exactly are. I think that's all great. I want to make sure we don't get distracted into thinking that we need to decide on something like this and build it into the bundle protocol specification. It really belongs in documents of its own.
I agree.
Rick, with the chair hat on, following on from that, I agree as well. I think Scott and the working group spent a little bit of time making sure that, for example, in bundle protocol section 5.4, as you draw out here, I think the text is sufficiently open to say the forwarding strategy applies to stop us having to specify in the bundle protocol spec what that forwarding strategy will be, but pointing to where it is. How are we doing for time? We're on time. Okay. So I'll shut up.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's why I separated those two. I still think though that the one-hop view of the network would make sense, even for a large interpretation of the model protocol. But
from Rick speaking personally, I really like your CLA endpoint ID thing. I think that would be a really interesting document to write up, and I would include the link local one-hop bit as part of that document to say this would introduce a forwarding strategy, ref, a bundle protocol section 5.4. If you're using CLA IDs, then this could be a step there. So back point to the original one, I think would be the easiest way of doing it.
All right. Next slide, please. So so during the hackathon, I also took the opportunity to try and develop the BPSec, which I mostly did. So again, not much comment. The draft is pretty clean, quite easy to understand. I would have some proposition though. I feel that those drafts were developed, maybe they did not move as fast as the BPPs or a bit independently, because there are some things that I found a bit odd. Why do we have integrity in the BPBs if it's covered by the BPSec? I feel like those two are kind of, it's okay, they work together, but it's twice the service. Another thing was when in BPSec, encryption modifies the block in place. meaning that when you need to parse it, if you don't know that the content has been modified, the parser will throw an error. So I added in the block header, I added a little a flag that says that the block is encrypted. It could be, if you want to be generic, you could just say the block has been modified or is unintelligible. So don't try to parse it until it's been decrypted. In the abstract security block, so in the BPSec specification, there was a lot. I mean, I was a bit confused with the security station ID. I think maybe it's a mistake, but the abstract security block should mention cipher suite ID rather than security station.
Sorry, so Ed Borain, if you implemented this with the security association block, that's terrific, because we just had put that together maybe 2 weeks ago, or just right before the end, and we're going to talk about that sort of next. So BPSec version 7 was the sort of standard version. We had taken it to other communities for feedback, and one of the feedbacks was to try and understand this distinction between cipher suite IDs and security associations. So we said we would take, I think, no more than an hour and try and look at what a security association intersection would look like, just to present it here, but not to say that that was fully considered.
So there is two things. There is a security association block, which mentions security association ID, and then there is a block integrity and block confidentiality, which both derives from the abstract security block, which mention also security association ID, but I think what it mentions really is cipher suite ID.
So and if you look at BP version 7 and sort of that laid out version, that is exactly how it is used.
Okay.
And what I would say is, let's talk about that in just a minute.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Can you move to the next slide? So that's information for the graph, but basically that's what it looks like right now. It's a fairly modular architecture, so every red blocks on the left graph are modules that can be loaded on runtime. So there is modules, so every convergence layer is a module. So a module is just a program that include the API, and then it can do pretty much everything. So every convergence layer is a module. Routing, so because we have this notion of link table on routing table, a module can passively feed the routing table. So if we were to implement the Prophet draft, basically what it would do is that it would have its own chat protocol over bundle. It would probably send messages to a DTNet/Prophet, and then they would feed the routing table using their own strategy. And we also have the active routing protocols, which is a routing block, basically. So if you develop your own routing block, you when the forwarding has failed or the delivery has failed, and it tries to find a custody routing module, that's where it would find it. And eventually, you have also the application agent adapter. So this one was developed for, you can statically bind to the program by compiling your program directly with the lib. But you can also talk to a daemon through TCP, a local socket. So application agent module basically makes a link between the actual applications that wants to talk to the local daemon on the daemon. So right now there is only one. It's something called LDCP. It's for libDTN client protocol. And then you have the connection agent which marshals the services of the convergence layer to instantiate channel. And the discovery agent, who is actually taking care of discovering nodes in the LAN. So if you're in the IP network, it will try to discover its IP peers, and if it does, it may ask the connection engine to create a connection. So that's in discovery agent. That's where you would decide whether you want a secure link, in which case you would want to use a STCP over TLS or TCP/CL before. The strategy would be there. On BPBs is mostly this big block, blue block in the middle that just takes in bundles, try to deliver forward, and takes it out into storage. That's a work in progress, but basically I wanted to do a small bundle node neighbor discovery. So I think it would be interesting to have some core services, core application agent that provides some services. Like I was thinking of a new agent that would put every bundle it received into the trash. So that could be useful for ping or traceroute. Because the implementations I've seen so far, when they implement ping, they implement an actual application agents that should send and receive ping bundle. And I think we already have everything because we have the administration records that can say the bundle was forwarded or delivered. But what to do with that bundle that we received? By default, it would put it in cache. So if we had a /null, we could still be able to send administrative records, yet no need to spend much time on processing the bundle. And the hello one was just so the convergence layer give to the bundle node CLI IDs. Now we would want to use hello to send all the other DTN IDs that are local to my bundle nodes or some others. It's basically for a simple routing protocol. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much. So Rick, as chair, conscious of time, if you were to write up the CLA idea as an individual draft, Rick, without a chair hat on, I would support that. I think that's really interesting. I totally agree with your approach there. So
I already started.
Excellent. So,
so therefore, your experience of BPBIS, is there any changes that should be made to the draft from what you have done up to now?
Other than those I mentioned, no. I think it's, as I said, it's a pretty clean draft.
Therefore, could you send the changes that you would like to see on the mailing list?
Sure. So, thank you.
Other questions?
Any other questions? I think we kind of covered them in line. I'm conscious of time, actually.
Right.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good point. Good point. Thanks, Nick.
Okay.
How do we
Try this. It didn't work for everybody. We'll see.
Oh, there we go. Hey. Hi, my name's Ed Brain, and I want to talk about the bundle protocol security specification. So this had gone through a series of reviews. It was put into working group last call. It did get a preliminary security AD review. Coming out of the preliminary security AD review, there were one or two sort of minor comments. I think the most significant comment was cleaning up some of the language to require that our confidentiality suites use AEAD cipher suites, that we always have a signature on the cipher text, and otherwise to just make sure that we included that our integrity mechanisms, other than that, were always on the open plain text if we were just providing integrity on other blocks.
Just a small, I don't think you had security AD review, but security director.
Security director.
Oh, I'm sorry, security director review. My bad.
You know, minor, but just it's actually in the process of slightly.
No, it would be good to be correct. So we had incorporated all of that feedback, and we were taking it out to other communities for review. Another one of those communities was the CCSDS, which also gave it a security review, and they came back with a series of recommendations. Most of them were specific to CCSDS and would not apply to BPSec. We just a few weeks ago were at another CCSDS meeting, and they had another set of recommendations, and we wanted to talk about those one of those recommendations here. So briefly, yeah, maybe. So at the last IETF, we asked a series of questions as to whether we needed to make any changes to BPSec. One of them, did we need additional graphics to make the specification clearer? We felt the answer was no. It was good to hear that an implementer of BPSec felt that the spec was clear and easy to walk through as well. We asked the question, could cipher suites alter the size of the target block's data fields? We said that yes, that is allowed, and we do have mechanisms now for accomplishing that without much difficulty. Do we need language to allow cipher suites to be able to remove blocks from a bundle? We said no, that could be something that is in cipher suite specific implementations, and it just needs to not be precluded by the specification. It doesn't need to be explicit in the specification. And then finally, there was some question as to, do you want the specification to prevent adding a BCB and a bib on a target at the same time, because no one would ever do that. They would always, if they were adding encryption at the time a bundle was created, they would always encrypt and then have an integrity, a signature on the ciphertext, and you would not need a bib. And while we said that that is a good practice, that is not something that needs to be mandated in the specification. So that was sort of the totality of open questions from the last IETF. Next slide. Then when we went, well, I'm sorry, there was one last part of this. Oh, that didn't translate well. There was one last part of this, which was, could we make a change to BP-BIS to say that the block type specific fields would always be represented by a CBOR byte string? And if it was always represented by a CBOR byte string, then what you would pass into ciphertext is the plain text of the data and not the CBOR byte string header length. And in cases where the cipher suite does not alter the size of the plain text, then you would not alter the overall size of the CBOR block type specific fields, and therefore would not alter the size of the block being encrypted. And we agreed to make that change, and we had talked about that on the mailing list. So next slide. Then when we went to CCSDS security review, there were additional minor comments. Many of them dealt with adding additional hooks into CCSDS documents for cipher suite selection and background context material and how this would be used. None of that would be appropriate in the BP-SEC RFC or the draft document. One question that came up at that meeting a few weeks ago was whether or not there was value in trying to talk about the security parameters as a security association, in the sense that BIBs and BCBs, instead of having cipher suite identifiers and instead of having cipher suite parameters, would simply have a security association identifier, and it would be presumed that either out of band or using some other mechanism in the bundle, you would be able to define what exactly that security association was. We were not convinced at the time that that was the correct way to go, because security associations, one, is a very loaded term, and it does imply that you have done a lot of back-to-back negotiation and state synchronization that you cannot do in a DTN. But what we decided to do was just to try and prototype what it might look like, to say, let's create a draft version of the document that has a stab at security associations in it. If we don't like it or we want to do something different, it's obviously very easy to correct that. So what we did was we came back and said, a way of looking at this is to say that right now BIB and BCB carry cipher suite identifying information and parameter information with it. If you were to extract that information away, give it a handle, and then call that handle the security association, then what would that look like? It doesn't necessarily change the information that's currently being moved back and forth. What it changes is how we package it in the bundle itself. So if we go to the next slide, we would say in this proposal, and I would look at it as simply a proposal to the working group, a security association would be it would be an identifier, and it would optionally be a definition block, which would extract the cipher suite parameters and so on into that block. Next slide. And this is what it could look like if this was something we wanted to do. On the left and the right would be sort of an original block layout to BPSEC version 7, where a BIB or a BC block 1 on the left would have a cipher suite ID, security source, parameters, and the security results. And on the right, you would have the same thing, but for a different block. And what you could do instead, again, as proposal, is to pull out that cipher suite ID, security source, and association parameters into a block at the top. And then the individual blocks, one, become much smaller because they could then point to the security information that's already up in the block.
Ed, sorry, Rick Taylor. Did you, you and I had a conversation at the start of the week about this. Did you update your slides to cover any of that, or would you like me to make that comment?
No, please make that comment.
Okay, so my comment when Ed was talking about this with me was, and I think it's the same comment Lucien has, which is there isn't really any difference between a cipher suite ID and a security association ID. If you think, instead of a cipher suite ID being the identifier of the cipher suite you are using, you say it's just the identifier of the way I am applying security to this block. And it can either be inline, So it is actually as the original Cipher Suite ID was. So I'm putting all my n tuple of IV and salt and whatever is required, including the identifier of the Cipher Suite I'm using, and it's all in line in the block. Or you can say it's a reference to a security identifier block. So you have the proposal of the security associations. And I've completely forgotten the third example. Damn it!
Well,
sorry. It was the null security identifier or something. I can't remember.
So my comment on that was to agree with Rick. The concept of
Pre-placed. That was it. It was for people who wanted to say, I actually have a security association pre-configured out of band between my two endpoints, and I just want to refer to it by an ephemeral identifier. So I want to say, this is number 4. And we all know what number 4 is, but no one else does. And all I have to send you is 4, and you know what I mean.
And what's important about all of those is that none of these add or remove particularly technical abilities. I could have a Cipher Suite ID 7 and a parameter could be pony, and that is an out-of-band meaningful thing, and that's the same as saying I have a security association of 3, don't worry about how we made it or what it means. The thing I don't like about this approach is security association is a loaded term. It implies a certain set of meaning that does not exist or cannot be guaranteed to exist in a DTN. There may be value in the size compression here so that you do not need to repeat Cipher Suite ID and Cipher Suite parameters. One way of handling that was with target multiplicity, so maybe there is a significant size compression. So the question, and so perhaps the comment back to other communities looking at this is security association is the wrong term. Maybe handle or reference or something like that is a better term. But term aside, is there a value in having the BIB and the BCB include a reference to Cipher materials as opposed to the Cipher materials themselves? Now, that is ultimately a relatively small change one way or the other, and arguably it doesn't rise to great significance in this, but it is sort of, as we collect subject matter expert review of the spec, that becomes the latest question. Do we want to have BIBs and BCBs include some kind of reference, which can be a reference to something in band or a reference to something out of band, rather than Cipher Suite ID and Cipher Suite parameters? Or would we say Cipher Suite ID can itself act as a reference to something in band or something out of band, and therefore we don't need something new?
So Rick, again, as part of my conversation earlier with Ed about this, I agreed that the terminology of an SA is so loaded with IPsec. You know, people know what an IPsec SA is, and IPsec relies on a complete end-to-end connectivity, and that just doesn't exist in a DTN. So we should not use the word security association. Equally, if we are to introduce the idea of indirection, and I can see the advantages in terms of compression, and also maintaining the idea of an out-of-band security association, in quotes, not an SA, then Cipher Suite ID also is the wrong word. So I think by renaming, we change we say, look, this is a different paradigm, so we change security context ID. There you go, thank you, Mark. A proposal such as that, and then it's a new definition that can be defined. You can say it refers to another block in the bundle, or it's inline and includes the Cipher information, or it's a pre-placed thing, pre-shared, and it's just a whatever that's required, an opaque blob of number 4. You know.
The only concern about that, and it is a minor concern, is if, and I'm not disagreeing, but if we have some sort of a reference or context ID that by its nature is ephemeral, and you are in a DTN, there may be some question of you then assume that if something has been queued for days or weeks, and when it gets to another end and it says I have context X, that may have been expired in some way. Whereas if you say I've been encrypted with a certain set of keys and so on. I mean, keys themselves are ephemeral, so it may not be a difference that makes a difference, but it is another ephemeral thing that we need to worry
I completely agree with you, but I don't see that that's a problem with the specification. If people want to, if people want to set up an ephemeral relationship and some of the bundles last longer than that ephemeral relationship exists, then, and I'm looking at Stephen to tell me that we ought to document that that is a hole you can fall in, but that's a hole you can fall in because you dug it.
Lucien speaking. Just a little remark. I see another problem in orphaning the encryption with the parameters of the encryption, separating those two in context rather than embedding the. It's if you have a node in between that wants to check, for instance, the integrity, and it doesn't have the parameters of how the integrity was computed, just have a context that it doesn't have because it wasn't part of the trusted parameters, the nodes. Then they can do it, and they can forward corrupted bundles, even though they would be able to check for integrity, and they could have stopped the propagation. So I think it's interesting to this approach. If I understand, you still can derive the parameter of the encryption and the integrity using the security association ID, right? It's all embedded in the bundle. So,
well, in this case, it would be all embedded in the bundle, but in concept, that security association block or context definition block would be optional. And so in your case, if it were not there and that information were not there, then waypoint nodes, for example, could not do integrity checks and throw out bad data early.
Right. It probably is pros and cons in both ways.
Chair hat on, we are out of time, so
okay.
Keep going, Stephen, but there's coffee outside.
Just very quickly, yeah, maybe, but like, so you can't take all the parameters away from all the blocks. So if you break up a bunch of ciphertexts and it's one encryption and has one nonce, that's one thing. But if you're calling the modes each time separately for a bunch of blocks, then you kind of have to have a nonce separately with each one.
Yeah.
It's like AES-GCM, for example, right?
Yeah.
So you can't always kind of punt, unless you want to have like a whole shitload of nonsense.
Then you're going to have a whole boatload of these sort of security definitions, and at that point, you've actually increased the amount of data in the bundle because you're tracking all of that plus the extra block types and so on.
Right, but in that diagram, it kind of gives the impression that you can kind of hide all the parameters in one place, where this is not always true, and it depends on block sizes and modes of operation and all sorts of stuff.
And the other point being is that in cases where all the cipher suite parameters do happen to line up, the spec allows you to stack security results in the one block. So you're not having multiple blocks in that case anyway. So there's no, so my recommendation is we templated this just to see what it would look like. I think we've gotten a couple of examples here as to what could be problems with that. The question to the working group, and we can certainly post something to the list, is this something that is valuable in any way or no, and we should go back to as we had it in BPSec version 7? And the two comments that I heard make me feel like this is an interesting experiment, but is not something that we would want to standardize.
Chair hat on, we're under a lot of pressure to actually get documents finished. We have yet to finish anything, and I know we're waiting on the convergence layers, but I would be nervous about saying, well, let's respin BPSec with some exciting new ideas because we've come up with them while we were waiting to finish it. It might be something, with my pragmatic hat on, you could retrofit this by introducing a new cipher suite ID of, and now we do indirection blocks into somewhere else.
Absolutely.
It might cost us an extra integer or an extra field in our CBOR block, but that I think might be better than stalling this for another 24 months.
That would be not the desired outcome.
Yeah.
Right.
We're out of time.
We're out of time.
Would you have a final slide or something?
Oh, do I? I don't know. Do I have a final slide?
Well, you have many other slides. I'm
No,
asking if you have some, last concluding
No,
slide or remarks.
The last remark was This was a comment that came back from the CCSDS. We said that we would present it. We thought a way to present it would be to come up with the draft, so if anyone wanted to read it, they would be able to give a review. You have read it and gave an implementation of it, and then came back with some reviews. So in that sense, it was a worthwhile endeavor. I am going to post to the working group a mailing list, but my sense is we should not do this, and there are other ways that we could accomplish the same result.
Following on from that, and I know we're out of time. Thank you very much, everybody. But I'd have no objection if you wanted to change Cipher Suite ID to Security Context ID, left it fairly generic such that this could be brought in a later document.
Sure, fair enough.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you all. I assume you all did your blue sheets or you've crept in for Manet. Manet is coming up next and is possibly of interest to the same people who were just sat in DTN. Thank you.